Kurtzman. I'm a senior fellow at the Milken Institute, and this is Global Risk. I'd like to welcome everybody, and I know you've had quite a number of minutes to admire us sitting up here, but now the panel is going to begin. So let me introduce our panelists. We have Jim Brooks on my far right, President and CEO of Americas for Control Risk. General Wesley Clark, Chairman and CEO of Wesley Clark and Associates, and retired Army General and former Supreme NATO Commander, Allied Commander for NATO. Ambassador Hussein Haqqani, Director South and Central Asia, Hudson Institute, and former Ambassador of Pakistan to the U.S., and Ambassador Paul Wolfowitz, visiting scholar, the American Enterprise Institute. So this is a very accomplished, very plugged-in group, and I would like to begin with a topic that's on a lot of people's minds, which is Ukraine. And General Clark, you just returned from Ukraine, and I wonder if you could give us some of your observations as to what you encountered and how you think things are likely to turn out.
Well, in Ukraine, there's an interim government which the United States is working with and the Europeans are working with. Of course, Russia has reacted very strongly to the former President Yanukovych's being pushed out of office, because Putin and Yanukovych had an understanding, and Yanukovych would bring Ukraine back toward Russia. And that understanding's gone, Yanukovych is gone, and Ukraine is loose. It's up for grabs. Putin has always dreamed that he would recapture Ukraine. If he gets Ukraine, Belarus comes in, Kazakhstan falls in, and then the Soviet Union is reassembled. So it's always been part of the big plan, and it seems to be in play right now. What's actually unfolding in Ukraine is a Russian military plan. The Ukrainian interim government has a copy of the plan. Now, like all plans, it has many branches on it, and it can go any which way. But it involves, first, the seizure of the Crimea. Secondly, it will be eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, with a push coming from, could we have slide 11?
Slide 11, please.
Just need to see this on the map.
It's not up yet.
Okay. Because this is essentially a military plan, but it's a very sophisticated military plan that uses the press, public information, deception by the foreign ministry and public statements. It uses Russian special forces who've infiltrated into Ukraine, and Ukrainian,
Okay, we have it.
Advisors in there, or traders in there who are working with it. Well, okay, so I can't point on this map.
No.
If you look at Ukraine in purple right here, and if you look at the way it's outlined on the map, you can see the Black Sea there. So the little island that's sticking out of the Black Sea already belongs, it's already under Russian control. That island is connected to the mainland with power, utilities, water, commerce over a 3-kilometer wide or 3-mile wide isthmus. And Putin has to have that part of Ukraine that it's connected to economically, or it's tens of billions of dollars of investments to reroute all that stuff. In addition, in that eastern part, which shows up on this map as the sort of lower right part of Ukraine, they also have a lot of secret military-industrial complexes there that are doing classified work for the Russian military-industrial complex. Putin's got to have that back. And it's not majority Russian, it's minority Russian. There are a lot of retired military in there, but they're not majority Russians in there. These are Ukrainians. Further up on the map, of course, toward Kiev, which you can see marked there, as you go up to the left on Ukraine, what you're going to see is more and more anti-Russian sentiment in that part of Ukraine. In green is marked, bright green is a country called Moldova, where there's a Russian reinforced brigade. So that brigade next phase of the plan is that brigade attacks to the lower right toward the Crimea. Forces surrounding eastern Ukraine attack inward, and forces from Russia that have been positioned in Belarus which is shown in blue here, then come in behind Kiev and close it off. And there's chaos and it falls. The preconditions for the plan are, of course, that the interim government loses control on the ground. The Russians can then come in as, quote, peacekeepers under UN auspices, if they can get it, or they can declare that they have the right to protect Russian citizens and come in that way. And the idea is to diffuse world opinion, confuse people. There'll be a lot of obfuscatory statements released about this by Foreign Minister Lavrov and others, and then, but in the end, they'll have Ukraine. When they do that, the Ukrainians will fight. So how hard they fight and what the consequences are remains to be seen. When I was over there, I was surprised because the word in the West was the Ukrainians didn't have the stomach for a fight. That's not what I found from talking to the leadership there. I found they got a lot of stomach for a fight. 6 Ukrainian brigades have served with United States forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. They very much are Western. All the businessmen do business with Russia, but they want their own country. This is an invasion. And it has significant consequences.
So let me ask you, what should the U.S. reaction be at this point, assuming your assessment is correct and there is an invasion, takeover of Ukraine? Is there anything the U.S. can do? We heard a week before the takeover of Crimea from Defense Secretary Hagel that there'll never be a land war again. So is that our policy? Are we prepared? Is there something where we might get sucked into this?
Well, we don't have a defense treaty with Ukraine. We do have a defense treaty with Ukraine's neighbors who are members of NATO. They're very nervous about this already. We do have a treaty with Ukraine that says we respect their borders. Russia had the same treaty. They're not respecting their borders. But we don't have the obligation to enforce that. But the consequences for this action are global. This comes on the heels of not taking military action in Syria. China's watching. China's cleared its air defense identification zone. Our allies in the Pacific are nervous. And so even though there's no real obligation to do anything here, this will still be viewed in the context of U.S. versus Russia, and it will be taken as a litmus of America's strength and resolve. These people in Ukraine want to be with the West. We never intended that, at least when I was a NATO commander, there was never any thought they'd be part of NATO. We never wanted to station troops there, and we never wanted to have a fight there. So it's a real dilemma for American policy. We'd like to settle this diplomatically, economically, and convince Putin to spit it out and go back and let Putin be Putin in Russia.
Okay.
But Joel, this is, you've got to stop, administration should stop talking about this as a violation of international law. I don't mean that it isn't a violation of international law, but it's not as though this is happening in some remote Pacific island. It's happening in the heart of Europe. It is a violation of one of the most fundamental post-Cold War agreements on European security, under which, we should say over and over again, the Ukrainians gave up nuclear weapons, and they gave up a naval base in Crimea in exchange for the U.S. We have an obligation. The U.S., the U.K., and Russia committing was the word, to the territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine. That was done by President Clinton personally. It was reaffirmed in 2009 when President Obama met with Medvedev. This is a very serious violation of the order in Europe. Moreover, it's done on a principle, and I don't want to go back to Munich because Putin is not Hitler, but this idea that you can intervene in another country to protect an ethnic minority would apply across most of Eastern Europe and most dangerously in the Baltic states. So this is something that engages U.S. interests in a major way. And you ask what could be done, I would say one place to start is in Syria. For 3 years, we've watched Putin's allies slaughter innocent Syrian civilians, and we've done nothing to arm the decent people in Syria. Demonstrating that we can do that would be a very powerful signal.
Well, I want to, and then I'll get to you, Ambassador Haqqani, but let me just ask the both of you on that point. What's the message, if there is in fact an invasion of Ukraine, that we are sending, or the world or Russia is sending to Iran, Syria, and the rest of the Middle East. Let's start with you.
Look, I think it
Ambassador.
depends crucially on whether the Ukrainians are prepared to fight, and if they're prepared to fight, whether they're getting the support they need to do that. I mean, I agree with the people who say the U.S. can't fight everybody's wars, but it is possible that Ukraine could do for Putin what Finland did 70 years ago for Joseph Stalin and demonstrate that people who are prepared to fight for their independence are not people you should tangle with. But it's not going to happen without some, I think, encouragement and support from the U.S. And my understanding is we're doing the opposite. We're telling them, don't be provocative, don't raise issues, don't advertise the fact that you've captured Russian special forces messing around in your country.
So,
I have
Ambassador,
three very quick comments from the perspective of America's non-Western allies and non-Western adversaries. Basically, America was feared or America was admired. It's neither right now. And a recent Pew poll showed that most Americans do not want foreign entanglements. That's one thing. But they still want to make money internationally, which is perfectly legitimate. What I want to ask is, how do they make money internationally when others don't want them to be able to do it on their soil and in their territories? So that's point number one. Point number two, if America wants to remain the world's leading military power, but does not want to exercise that military power, then that's almost as bad as not having it. And third, there are forces such as Al-Qaeda, which people are now forgetting about because Americans do many things very well, but they don't do history well and they don't do patience well. And so anything that requires patience, now Mullah Omar used to say that Americans have the watches and we have the time. And so these guys are watching, and they're sitting there and they're saying, you know what, this global superpower is not going to do anything. And so I see a correlation between the new Al-Qaeda video that came out of Yemen and the whole Ukraine situation, because they were lying low.
Familiarize us with that video.
So the number 2 in Al-Qaeda came out with this video with about 100 Al-Qaeda people parading like a regular army in Yemen. And then, talking about how we will strike America again. Watching that video as somebody who does this for a living, it reminded me of a video that bin Laden has issued just before 9/11, and about which John F. Burns had written in the New York Times, and ironically, it was in the New York Times electronic edition, which I read in Pakistan, where I was at that time, and it was pulled out on the morning of 9/11 because the New York Times foreign editor thought it was too alarmist, except a few hours later that happened. So the Islamist extremist threat is not yet gone either. And now you have allies in Europe, allies in the Middle East, potential allies in Central Asia, and potential allies in East Asia, all worried about whether America will back them up in case of various conflicts emerging in their respective theaters of war.
And to carry that forward on the issue of Iran, I mean, we're talking about negotiations. We're in the midst of negotiations with Iran on nuclear, high nuclear stakes. Pakistan and India, both nuclear armed, both tense, almost came to nuclear blows in the 90s. An election in India that could add tension to the region. What is the role of the U.S. and how do some of these forces play out? Jim, do you have a view on some of these issues?
I think it's quite interesting when we look at Iran, because I think right now President Obama is looking at leaving his legacy largely as cementing a deal in Iran. So I think if I talk to non-Western, non-U.S. people doing business in Iran, there's a real feeling in Tehran that it is going to open for business soon, that there is going to be success, that the sanctions are going to be lifted, and people are right now lining up and sizing the opportunities for investment into Iran. So who's going to put in the infrastructure, who's going to bring oil back to production at peak levels, et cetera. So I think it'd be very interesting to hear Ambassador Haqqani's view of where really the sectarian divide is and whether we're going to see issues between Saudi and Iran play out.
The Shia and the Sunni divide. But before I go there, one quick comment, and that is that I don't think India, Pakistan, or Iran are going to use nuclear weapons, very frankly. I think what Pakistan has demonstrated, and it's my country, and I've written a book about it, which I'll be signing in a little while. That was the commercial break.
Very good book, too, by the way.
But what Pakistan has demonstrated is that by acquiring nuclear weapons, you get the capability of having a second tier of conflict, which is subconventional, meaning terrorism, various kinds of subconventional operations. And that is where Iran is headed. Whether it gets the nuclear weapons or whether it gets Western assurances in return for not making nuclear weapons and therefore has less sanctions on it, it frees Iran to operate at two levels. Do business with the West, make money, open up the economy a little bit, and yet at the same time use various militant groups, etc., in various parts of the Muslim world. And that brings us to this emerging Shia-Sunni divide. It's not a sectarian war. Shias and Sunnis have lived together. They've occasionally fought too. But the problem right now is that the Saudis dread the Iranian acquisition of nuclear weapons and the potential for Iran causing trouble with their Shia population. And there are Shia populations almost all over. Only last week in Jakarta in Indonesia, which has never had significant sectarianism because there aren't that many Shias there, they had the World Anti-Shia Conference. So that's obviously the Saudis fueling that. Are we, any of it, since we are talking about global risk, are any of us thinking about the potential of a new 100 years war like Europe had between Protestants and Catholics? And what are the consequences of it going to be? We've had some in Lebanon. We are seeing some sectarian dimension to Syria. But what if it starts becoming a sectarian issue in almost every Muslim majority or Muslim concentration country? It's not just about the Middle East. West Africa, the Middle East, South and Central Asia. We must remember India is the world's second largest Muslim concentration of population. And then East Asia, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. And last comment, almost all of them except South Asia have oil under their soil. And even with fracking, America may have become energy independent with it, or may have the potential of becoming energy independent, but Japan, China, and Europe are far from it.
Let's go to slide 1, please. If you look at slide 1, you see the tremendous disparity there economically between Russia and, let's call it, the West, EU and US. We're talking about a very small country in terms of its economy, about the size of California. We're talking about a country that has been spending $90 billion a year on defense. We have been spending alone $640 billion or so, plus NATO has $100 billion or so that it spends. So if you look at this in terms of strength, the strength is overwhelmingly in the West. But General Clark, why is the West, if this is a correct observation, unable to flex its muscles or unwilling to flex its muscle given this huge disparity?
Well, we don't see the future of the world involving muscle flexing. I mean, it's about trade and development and businesses. The head of Siemens just went to Moscow to assure Vladimir Putin that don't worry about this, we're still going to bring you your technology and do your project developments. And when you try to talk to people in Europe about geostrategy, their eyes glaze over. Whereas if you talk to Russians, especially those who've been educated the way Vladimir Putin's been educated, they see the world as a chessboard. This is my country. That's your country. This country we can fight over. This country, it belongs to me. I'm selling it the weapons. And that's the way they see things. So you're up against a disparity. You know, democracies we take a long time getting our ideas together. Whereas Putin has a very strong idea. He wants the Soviet Union to be reassembled. And for those in Germany and elsewhere, they want to do business with Russia. Ukraine is a distraction. So I was in Bulgaria recently. I spoke to the president of Bulgaria, and I asked him his perception. He said, we're having this discussion with Germany. Germany says great powers should have their sphere of influence. Bulgaria says this is totally unacceptable, because what that means for Bulgaria is we'll never have stability in Bulgaria. We'll be torn between Russia's influence and the West's influence. We joined NATO because we wanted stability. So, as Paul said earlier, we're going to have to face this issue. This is about international law. It's about moving forward in the 21st century. And it may require, there's a
Ambassador-
military dimension to this, but it's not about defense budgets per se.
Joel, 100 years ago, precisely May of 1914, a general consensus was that economics and trade had made war obsolete. 3 months later, we started what was then the worst war in history, which led later to an even worse war, led to Bolshevism, led to Maoism, led to Nazism, made the next 50 years by far the bloodiest, most awful half-century in history.
See, some people know history.
Absolutely. Well,
And by the way, the Japanese and Germans should be glad that we don't do history. But let me just finish this point. The next 50 years have been, the 50 years that we're enjoying now have been a period of incredible progress in many spheres, and particularly in trade and economics and wealth creation. And a lot of people sitting in this room, and myself personally and my kids, have benefited from the stability. Even during the Cold War, we had a considerable measure of stability among the great powers. And since the end of the Cold War, I'm not saying Rwanda isn't a tragedy, and there are tragedies, and Afghanistan and Iraq are difficult, but nothing comparable to what happens when the earthquake comes. And I just worry that we're seeing the first stages of a possible earthquake, and to minimize its
And
importance.
by earthquake, you're saying forces analogous to 1914 coming together in terms of a major conflagration?
Possibly, or analogous to what happened in the Middle East in the 1970s when the British bailed out of the Persian Gulf and the United States was crippled by Vietnam and unwilling to step in. It was followed by the rise of jihadism, by a terrible bloody war between Iran and Iraq, a long list of miseries, which was the takeover.
So at minimum, less order in the world compared to what we've enjoyed.
And damaging to the material progress that we've enjoyed, yes.
But look, this is not about making a choice between chewing gum and walking straight. I mean, it's not like, the whole world is only about who can we bomb and who can we take out for lunch. There are far more options. When you are the world's largest military power, you can flex muscle without causing war.
And how would you do that?
You've done that successfully for a long time. I mean, you choose theaters where occasionally, for example, General Clark was commander when muscle was successfully flexed in the former Yugoslavia. The reason why you need to understand the history is not so that you end up carrying grudges, which I think coming from a country where grudges are kept for a long time, I think you're great not having the grudges. But being aware of other people's grudges is important. I mean, for example, Americans just didn't understand that the Serbs still wanted to settle the score of the Battle of Kosovo of 1389 or whatever the heck it was. And so knowing that is important. What I sense is that there is this sort of, either we are all engaged in the material world right now in economic progress and trade. It's important. They can go together. You can do geostrategy and economic progress both at the same time. You've done it before. You can do it again. I think Jim wants to say something.
I think what the numbers are missing here is these are the absolute numbers. And if you look at the shift over the last decade or 15 years, the relative growth has been in emerging markets. We've seen, the middle class globally go to 2 billion, expected to go to 3 billion. I think that's creating a lot of the risk because as you take people out of poverty that are becoming more and more urbanized, the world's more urbanized than living in rural society now, you change their expectations. And now they start worrying about, their influence, transparency within the governments. They want better economic opportunities. And when the world changes and the US and EU particularly pull back a lot of the economic support around the world, we see the legitimacy of these governments that have thrived through performance over the last decade come into question. Now what are they going to do? Are they going to go the complex route and restructure their governments, which is very hard to do? Most of them probably don't have the political clout or base to do. Or are they going to go an ideological route or populist route, which is destructive to global commerce and the economies?
So let me ask you, General Clark, you mentioned China before. We haven't really talked about how China views this. China, well, I guess it has one aircraft carrier which it bought from Ukraine, and it doesn't yet have a mature, compared to Western standards, armed forces. But how are they looking at this series of events that are playing out? Syria, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and so forth. What's their perspective, and what actions are they likely to take, and what conclusions are they likely to reach?
Well, President Xi Jinping is pursuing the China dream. And the China dream is a little elusive for our state. On the one hand, they want economic prosperity.
Can we have slide 10?
On the one hand, they want prosperity. That maintains the legitimacy of the Communist Party as the leadership of China. But they also want to regain China's historical role as the center of the world, basically. And so to do that, they've got to push the United States away, and they're building the military capacity to do that. By 2019, they will have 4 aircraft carriers. Now, this doesn't mean we're going to be in a fight with China. I hope we won't. But it does mean that if there's a crisis over an island chain or over the Philippines, when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff goes in to see the president, he's going to have to explain to the president that there's a chance that with China's targetable ballistic missiles, their submarines, their high-speed torpedoes, their aircraft carriers, and so forth, we may not have dominance of air, sea, or space in that region of the world if push comes to shove. So what this does is makes it less stable.
Now, there's an agreement with the Philippines for basing that's just been signed or is in the process of being signed. Is that going to make a difference?
It might. But the Chinese tell me that they're sending the Philippines $3.5 billion a month in remittances through Hong Kong. So, and their view of it is that when push comes to shove, the Philippines would rather have the $3.5 billion than the U.S. troop presence. There's a push going on in Asia, and you can feel it. And what's really difficult to see at this time is the big structure of the world has been the United States with Europe. And together we would, and held together by NATO, and together we would work and manage stability elsewhere. That's the structure that's coming apart. It's been taken apart step by step by U.S. overcommitment in the Middle East, by the fact we're withdrawing forces from Europe, by our attention.
Well, we sent 600
elsewhere.
troops to Poland.
It's actually less than that.
Okay.
It's a company here and a company there, and they're airborne infantrymen without any armor or appreciable. I mean, they're not a fighting force. They're just a tripwire force. Okay. And that's okay. I mean, we took some military steps there. But we're going to have to rethink our strategy as a nation, because it's one thing to say you've done what you did in Iraq, you're going to reduce your forces significantly in Afghanistan. It's another thing to say we're abandoning this security architecture that we put in place at the end of World War II. We're not ready to do that. And I always tell my Chinese friends, be very, very careful messing with the United States, because all we need is a real adversary to pull this country together. We're sitting here with 15% unemployment, counting disguised unemployment. We're not at full capacity in our factories. We're loafing along in the economy. This thing could come back together. Give us a cause. And I tell my Chinese friends, you won't like it. I mean, you think you can have 4 aircraft carriers? We could have a dozen more aircraft carriers by 2019 if you gave us a reason to have them. We'd love to do that. It's what America does best, is military power. But it's not what we want.
Joel, dictators don't do history very well either. They consistently interpret democratic process as a sign of weakness. And Churchill said it right after Pearl Harbor. The United States is like a giant boiler. It takes a while to light the fire, but once it gets going, the power it generates is unbelievable. And I think we're sending the wrong messages today, but I think the people receiving the messages are overinterpreting them.
Yeah. Jim, let me ask you how you see the China.
China's, amazing to me in many ways, and I think the energy is right now behind China. If we look at it on a global level, we see agriculture from Latin America up to Asia by double digits. We see it down to the U.S. and Europe. We see Middle Eastern oil up to Asia, down to the U.S. and Asia. We see minerals out of Russia, minerals out of Africa, up to Asia, down to the U.S. and Europe. So that's changing the direction and strategic influence. And I think most people do not give enough credit to the leadership in China. They're young, they're educated, they're global in their perspective, and they've spent a lot of time outside of China before going back to key leadership posts inside of China. They're not scarred from the Cultural Revolution, so they sort of take a fresh, forward, progressive-looking outlook. And there's not a real challenge to the single-party state. But again, going back to my middle class comments, we also have a huge middle class in China that has huge expectations to be met. And they're not as compliant, but they're not politically threatening either. So I think China has a lot behind it as far as forward momentum and strength from the population itself that we can't turn a blind eye to it.
And what about some of the weaknesses that are starting to appear in the Chinese economy, as in this chart here, with regard to current account balance? There's weakness in the banking sector and so forth. And there's an outflow of very talented Chinese, wealthy in many instances, to the United States, Australia, Canada, in smaller instances to Europe. So people are dissatisfied who have means and education, and they're leaving. Does that factor in, or is that too small?
I mean, I think the leadership is smart enough to deal with it. I think it'll be a bumpy ride. There's still a lot of investment going into China, so I think the leadership will find the route, and they're progressive. There's not a threat to the single-party state, and they've got a lot of state intervention tools that they can employ into the economy. So I think they're probably going to emerge strongly after a bumpy road. Probably.
And the U.S. doesn't want to have, as General Clark said, the U.S. does not want to, and it's not in America's interest to have a conflict with China.
Right.
I think the problem is more from the point of view of America's traditional friends in East Asia, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia. What do they think of China and how they view China? And that's where America has to start thinking. Education was mentioned in relation to China, but we also need to look at education in this country. Basically, the economic dimension of your strategic sort of role around the world. I mean, Richard Haas wrote the book that, foreign policy starts at home. Absolutely it does. It shouldn't end at home, but it certainly starts at home. And there's a lot to be done here and a lot to act. But basically, I think, Paul, you would agree with this particularly, that America just needs to start leading again. After the Second World War, if it had been left to Luxembourg and Belgium, NATO wouldn't have been created. America had to take the lead. Yeah. And I think that's what needs to be done.
Well, let's stay with you for a second to talk about India, Pakistan specifically. India, rising power, very large, more than 1 billion people, technology power and so forth. It's kind of hit the skids for a little while, at least in terms of growth. New president looks like will be Modi, who's economically very progressive, open economy and liberalization, but from a political perspective, not exactly a friend to Pakistan. Probably would not forgive the Taj Mumbai attacks of a few years ago, the way his predecessor did.
Look, Narendra Modi, of course, is a controversial person in the sense that he has had a problem with the Muslim population of India as well. But then he could very easily be a Richard Nixon minus the weaknesses, in the sense,
comforting.
In the sense that he's a single man who has no other aspiration in life except to lead India, and he is very clear about his economic agenda, and a lot of Indians believe him on the economic issues. So if he opens up India's economy, that'll be really good. That'll be good for everyone here and everywhere else in the world. 1 billion consumers. The potential is enormous. If he can invest in infrastructure, open the economy a little bit, consider some changes on issues of intellectual property rights, etc., the traditional issues on which India has been lagging behind, do something about some of the large unions and the public sector in India. So that'll be good. Question is, can he shake off the image of being a Muslim basher, which I think he's worked hard at during this election? My own view is that the India-Pakistan relationship has a level of stability at the nuclear level. Both have nuclear weapons, and therefore neither wants
stability meaning standoff, or stability meaning safety?
No, stability meaning standoff. Neither side able to change the status quo. Then at a conventional level also, India doesn't want a conventional war because it would affect its economic growth. The problem is the subconventional level. There, whether you read Carlotta Gall's book about, the wrong enemy, the New York Times reporter who says Pakistan's officials may have known about bin Laden being there, or whether it's about the various jihadi groups that are based in Pakistan.
And of course, you were ambassador to the U.S. from Pakistan at that moment.
I was ambassador to the United States from Pakistan when Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan, and had the very difficult task of convincing leaders back home that Americans had done the right thing, and convincing Americans that, the Pakistani government should not be held responsible for Osama being there. But there's a lot of, the story has many dimensions. The Pakistani intelligence service is a law unto itself. It doesn't listen to the civilians. And very soon after Osama bin Laden was found there, I found myself out of a job and in detention. The last time Pakistan and India came close to a nuclear exchange, or were believed to have come close to a nuclear exchange, was in 1999. As I told you, I was in prison at that time too.
Well, we're glad that you could get out of prison for this panel.
I promise you that Chevy Chase, Washington, D.C. is a lot better than a Pakistani prison. But coming back to India and Pakistan, so basically the question is, what can be done to get Pakistan out of the jihadi game? And with America withdrawing from Afghanistan, there will be changes in that region. Will Pakistan realize that it's a game that is not a winning game, that you can't just encourage jihadism, or will it fall further and further under the influence of Taliban ideology? And it's not just Pakistan. Remember, there are 4 ungoverned spaces in the Muslim world that are now a serious hotspot: Yemen, Somalia, parts of Africa, and Pakistan. And so the Islamist terrorist threat is not over. And Pakistan will continue to be an actor in that. Can Narendra Modi work out a relationship with the United States, get over the anger he might have personally over the US denying him a visa for the last 10 years, and then work with the West in a kind of a strategy that gets Pakistan out of the jihadi game and become the responsible partner in global relations that it could be? Look, everybody in this room probably knows some Pakistani. As I often say, we Pakistanis are a very charming people. I know that because I'm one myself. We are wonderful, great Pakistani bankers, doctors, dentists around here, etc. And people see us and then they say, what's wrong? These are nice people. Yes, we are nice people, but the state and the government we've created for years has taken a wrong turn for a long time. And so can Mr. Modi bring it back on some kind of track is the big sort of question.
So let's widen the Asia discussion. Ambassador Wolfowitz, you were ambassador in Indonesia. You have a long experience in that part of the world. As you look at it, China has obviously risen. We have conflict with Japan. We have the MH370 flight, which is occupying the whole region at the present time in terms of all their resources out in the sea trying to find this plane. So is this bringing people together in the region? How do you see the region evolving, and is it evolving in a copacetic way or in a way that has hotspots?
Before generalizing about the region, let me try to generalize about the 10 countries that make up the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And I'm sometimes surprised at how many Americans still seem to think Southeast Asia refers to a terrible war that we lost, and they don't want anything more to do with it, instead of recognizing that it's 600 million people, half the size of China, growing rapidly, with an economy, I think one of your charts shows, going to be larger than Japan's economy by 2030. Not one of your charts, sorry, it's from the Southeast Asia panel. And with countries that used to be pretty much everyone had a fight with every neighbor, the only fight they really have now is with China, and they're not completely unified in how to approach it, but it's a block of countries that are really a sort of, I think, a very useful balance between India and China, and I think incredible force for stability. One of the most remarkable stories of the last 20 years, and as someone who I have to admit that I fell in love with Indonesia. You have to be careful when you're an ambassador to remember you're not the country ambassador from that country, the ambassador to that country. But at least in Indonesia...
Unless you're forced to live in exile in that country.
Well, then it's different. But, when the Suharto dictatorship collapsed in 1998 after 50 years of 2 different dictators, a lot of people, smart people, said Indonesia is too poor, too Muslim to manage democracy. they manage it. It's chaotic. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of there's a free press, which now people are complaining is irresponsible. But it is stable to an extraordinary degree and prosperous with a large. So I think Southeast Asia is a real bright spot. I think the tensions between Japan and China, and a lesser extent Japan and South Korea, much of it I think fueled very deliberately by the leadership in Beijing, are very troubling. I don't think the Japanese have responded all that sensibly, at least on things, the symbolic end of it. But I think it's China that is pushing, and they're pushing, I think, frankly, to demonstrate to everybody, especially the Japanese, that the Americans aren't all that committed, that we can declare an air defense zone and the Japanese will complain, but we'll just say, well, it was done the wrong way.
Was Obama's trip to the region positive from that respect?
Well, I think there was one real huge blemish on that trip, and that was when he went to Malaysia and refused to meet with the leader of the opposition party, which in spite of all the rigging of Malaysian elections, managed to get 52% of the vote in the last election, not a majority of parliamentary seats, and is once again being railroaded on trumped-up charges of homosexuality. You would have thought just the law itself would be outrageous. I think, Malaysia actually, it's small, but just as Tunisia is small and could have been a leader of the Arab world because it had institutions, it had a successful economy, but the government would not open up, Malaysia has very much the same problem. It could be the leader. It's a Muslim-majority country with great economic progress, but there has to be some political change, and I think we missed an opportunity on that one.
Let's turn to the Americas, Jim. And we've had enormous problems, but growth in Mexico. Venezuela seems to be out of control right now, and growth has stopped. Brazil slowed down. We have a different set of circumstances in Latin America and South America today than we had just 5 years ago. The prospects are not looking as bright. How do you view the Americas?
So I think in the Americas, there's probably three categories. There's the ones that are probably going materially in the wrong direction. Venezuela, Ecuador, arguably, and Argentina, arguably. There's the ones that we need to watch, and I put Brazil in that bucket itself. And then I think there's actually...
And watch for what reason?
Watch because if they do not go through some very complex reforms, institution building within the country itself, infrastructure building, and address the middle class concerns, you could very likely see a similar issue that we've seen in the Arab Spring materialize in Brazil. I think the ingredients are there, and the population's ready and willing to protest has been evident. We're likely to see that accelerate through the World Cup, and so it'll be quite an interesting period.
So you think during the World Cup there could be protests?
Major disruptions.
Major disruptions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Strikes, disruptions of all the events. The infrastructure is not there to move people to quite disparate locations across the country. I think it's quite challenging. I think the ones on very positive tracks are Mexico. I think Mexico, between labor sector reform, making it more business friendly, they've had very pro-business policies or consistent business policies historically. I think we're seeing stability in the labor markets. I think with the oil sector reform, wage parity with China, we're seeing a lot more investment, particularly in heavy manufacturing.
Well, and Mexico is North America's largest
trading partner,
and also automobile producing
and aerospace as well.
Aerospace.
So I think Mexico has a lot going for it. It obviously has a very complex security situation, but it's manageable, and I think that's what doesn't play out very well in the media. It's got very high consequence events for people who happen to be in the wrong place or are involved with the trade itself, so you have to do your due diligence. You have to know who you're going to involve yourself with in Mexico, but you can be very successful in Mexico. I think Colombia, it's an interesting time. I had the opportunity to spend a day with former President Uribe on his finca about 6 months ago. And if you're listening to Uribe, he doesn't think Santos is going to succeed in the peace accords. He doesn't think that the country...
And those are peace accords between whom?
Between the FARC and the government. So basically getting rid of the 50-year-old insurgency that's plagued the country and actually most of the remote areas. I think the city centers, Medellin, Cali, and Bogota have largely been stable for quite quite a while, certainly the last decade. But I think we're seeing, so the question is, on the government side, can they succeed in the peace accords? And if they do, what do all these people who have been gainfully employed fighting the government do? And what we've seen is we've seen the emergence of a group called the Bakrims, which are basically organized crime. They go and use their skills that they used for countering the government to do other things that are logistics heavy. They're moving weapons, they're moving drugs, they're moving people. And that's the challenge. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think popular opinion, certainly in the media, is that they will succeed.
So, but you're bullish on Mexico at this particular...
I'm bullish on Mexico.
Okay.
And I think, please.
Let me come in on Mexico for a second, because they are going through this energy reform, and not only for the hydrocarbons, but also for electric power. It's going to really open up Mexico.
Absolutely.
And when you look at the geology of Mexico, and you look at what can be done there, and you look at their participation, Mexico is going to be a real energy partner for the United States, just like Canada is right now. So this North American energy complex is it's what's going to enable America to regain its world leadership power. One of the problems we're having in the United States, one of the reasons we're talking all these risk issues, is because this economy is just not growing the way it should be growing. It's not creating jobs. It's not producing a middle class that can afford to consume, and so the economic model is kind of shaky right now. We've got another chance to move forward if we handle the energy situation the right way, and Mexico's a big part of that. So my friends on Wall Street, they're all scrambling for Mexico right now, and I just came back from China, and all they can talk about is importing LNG. And the question is whether the United States can handle its natural gas industry rapidly enough to get us into the China market in such a way that we really raise our relationship with China from simply being someone who pays for Chinese manufactured goods to a real partner with China economically, and gives us the leverage that goes with that status. Mexico is going to be a big piece of that.
And the first major export terminal for LNG goes online in 2015, so not that far into the future.
It's not that far, but you can do it more rapidly through Mexico than you actually can in the United States. When you look at permitting and construction, it's easier to build a pipeline than it is to build that liquefaction plant. So you can have the Chinese and the Asian countries can build floating liquefaction plants faster than we can put them on shore, and tow them across the Pacific and put them there on the west coast of Mexico. And maybe it won't be 2015, but it'll be sooner than we can get it done. We need to do that.
So in the remaining couple of minutes that we have, I'd like everyone to give their views about, okay, we have a delicate situation in the world, a lot of risk. What should the U.S. do? Ambassador Wolfowitz.
Get back to a leadership role, and leadership doesn't mean taking on every job. It means helping other people do the work, but it's leading. It's not leading from behind.
And an example of that would be?
I think a great example of that, and a terrible, tragic, and strategic mistake, is Syria. I think the United States, especially early on, before there was bloodshed, before there was armed resistance, could have taken the lead and said, here's a peaceful solution that requires the departure of the regime but gives some guarantees to minorities, but it has to be backed up by a willingness to develop an armed option. We haven't done that. We could still do it. We would have some effect in doing it. And it would actually change perceptions in Moscow as well.
Ambassador?
Accept the fact that different countries and different parts of the world are at different levels in terms of their outlook. So, for example, soon after the Ukrainian situation evolved, an Obama administration official said, Putin is using a 19th century template in the 21st century. Yes, he is. But what are you going to do about it? So there are other nations who may want to use 19th century methods. You have to be prepared for it. You don't need to be overawed by the various risks in different countries, but you should also not ignore them. And I think basically the American public needs to be educated on the importance of the world to it, because you can't shrug your shoulders and say, opinion polling shows most Americans aren't interested in the world, therefore I'm not going to take an interest in the world either. The American leaders have to tell the American public, not only leading the world, you have to lead Americans into accepting that their own prosperity is partly connected to prosperity around the world and opportunities around the world.
General Clark?
The Ukrainians tell me that the medical brigades now are being mobilized in Russia to be sent to reinforce their troops that are surrounding Ukraine. Ukrainians believe the 9th, 10th, and 11th of May is the most likely time for the Russian action. So first priority is we've got to deter that action. We don't need, and the world doesn't need, a Russian military action to overrun eastern, southern, or all of Ukraine.
And how would you deter it?
Got to strengthen the capacity of the Ukrainians to defend themselves and convince Putin that this is something he can't handle and doesn't want to handle. But I agree you've got to do more with Syria too. I mean, that's another place you can take action. But the most important thing to do is restore this country's economic growth. And to do that, you've got to turn the energy sector loose. We're actually doing less in hydrocarbons on public lands today than we have in the past. It's gone down. We're not exploring, we're not fracking out there. The frack revolution for energy is the most unexpected and the greatest gift to America's geostrategy in the last 50 years. I mean, it's an incredibly powerful weapon. And even in China, try as hard as they might, they can't quite duplicate it. So we've got to use that and rebuild our economy. It's our economy that gives us the power in the world. And with that economy growing again, we'll pull Europe back toward us. But first things first, stop Putin's move into Ukraine.
Jim?
I think we have to recognize the limitations of hard power around the world. I think we've done that I think we've seen challenges in Syria and Ukraine have been well addressed here. But going back to old-fashioned diplomacy, building global institutions that have the diplomatic maturity in order to help govern the world. We can't do it alone. We can't do it just with the EU, so we got to build these alliances. I think we have to re-strengthen, rekindle the alliances maybe. I think we have to look at the impact that our withdrawal from QE is going to have on the world and be very careful with how quickly we pull out the resources that we're providing. So two things are happening. We're yanking resources from very fragile states around the world, which is going to give, certainly in any place that has a militancy issue, a chance to regroup, rekindle, and perhaps come back against us. And so we're pulling the resources away, the risk is increasing, and we're pulling QE away. So the legitimacy of these performance-based regimes or governments around the world is in question at a time that they're not going to be able to sustain the growth. So those two collide, and we may have a whole series of disruptions around the world.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, General Clark. Thank you, Ambassador Haqqani. Thank you, Ambassador Wolfowitz. And thank you.